Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this webinar tonight. We're going to be having Tom Carson present us on Masonic Pennies and 130 Years of Mystery, History, and Beautiful Coins. If you have any questions during this, you will be muted, so please use the Q&A or the chat functions and try to get them in by the end of the presentation so that I can just jump right into reading them to Tom. But without further ado, here's Tom.
Hello, my name's Tom Carson, and I've been collecting Masonic pennies for about the past 7 or 8 years. And I'm not a Mason. I discovered a penny and thought it was interesting, started researching and found out that how little was known. So this penny is going to go through the history, and I think there's something for the beginner and stuff for the extreme expert. So let's go ahead and get started. I said 130 years of mystery. Masons historically have been sort of a secret group or a society with mysteries. And it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly what they were doing. The history of the Royal Arch Mason Masonic penny: when you became a 4th degree Mason, you earned a penny. Well, the penny was something that evolved over time. In 1880, Marvin wrote the Medals of the Masonic Fraternity. It was a big book with thousands of Masonic medals, but they only mentioned 1 penny and a stock penny. So in 1880, Masonic pennies really weren't a big thing. There was a lot of people shaved U.S. large cents and engraved on them. Some of them even shaved silver dollars and gold pieces and engraved on them, but we don't know when that became important because the date of the coin is meaningless. A lot of those were done on old ones. The Masons usually engraved the date that they became a Royal Arch Mason, but they may have done that when years after the fact when their chapter started doing the pennies. Around 1890s when we believe that pennies really were started being made from dies. And then 1895, we know the shekel was developed by the King Cyrus chapter in Detroit. Okay, I said Marvin listed 2, a stock penny, and he listed one from a Mark Lodge. I'm going to zoom these in. And if y'all have trouble with me going too fast due to your internet connections, send a message real fast to Logan, and we can go from there. I'll try to slow down. But this is one of the early stock pennies. I've only ever seen 4. I've got 3 of them. One of them appeared on eBay one night. I looked at it. I came back in 10 minutes and it had already been sold. It had a buy it now of $300 and some. And I was having to think a while before I did that. But it was done by E.L. French of Chelsea, Massachusetts in 1884. The earliest one I've seen of this is 1876. So that would have fit well in Marvin's book in 1880. He would have known of the stock penny. The first one we know from a die was actually a Mark Lodge. It's Excelsior Lodge 216 of Philadelphia, and we know this existed in 1880. Let's go and look at the shaved dies real fast, shaved coins. as you can tell on the first two, one of them's on a British penny, the other one's on a US large cent. And then the third one was actually a silver dollar that somebody machined both sides from and did it. And we'll look at these real close for the engravings. This was Union Chapter, and right off the top of my head, I forget where Union Chapter was. I think it was Ohio. It's got a picture of a boot on it. And a lot of times the Mason's mark had something to do with their career. And we'll talk a little more about that down the line. Then this one was shaved on a US penny, and it was Gustav C.G. Snyder from Cumminsville, Ohio. And his is shearing shears. It looks to me like what you would shear sheep with. And this was done in 1904. The next one is really a neat piece. This was done by Charles E. Hicks of Pequa, Ohio. And Charles was the heir to the American Rolling Mill Company, Armco Steel. So he was fairly well off. He got involved with Meteor Ambulance Company and the Indy 500. And if you look at some of the early logos for the Indy 500, the mark is wings and a wheel. And this is also the logo now of the Ohio Highway Patrol. So it's really, the marks were really important, and we'll go more into that as we go on. The early dies on some of the Masonic pennies are very rare. These were done by Lovett, George Hampton Lovett of the famous Lovett die sinkers. And this one is the Washington chapter number 2 out of Houston. And you have it on a normal size die. Then evidently when they went around to the second stamping of it, they didn't have a small enough die, so they did it on an overside. But one of the things you'll notice is the reverse. This Lincoln chapter, Lincoln, Nebraska, was done by Lovett. These all 4 have what's called the Kalamazoo die on the back of them. And I just figured this out in the last week with help of Heath White. The Kalamazoo die was used by Henderson Ames Company, and Wright in his early books listed as the Kalamazoo die, and you find it on a lot of different pennies, the reverse. Well, Wright in his book said that, well, he named it the Kalamazoo die. He didn't name the company. But then he sent me some stuff the other day on Henderson Ames. Henderson Ames didn't have any die sinkers. They used dies done by other people. So Lovett made the dies and they used them. Now you'll notice I've got 3 here that I only have images of, and these are from the King book, and they're at the House of the Temple. I found no collections besides the House of the Temple that has these. The one on the right was a mistake by Lovett. He put Akron, Indiana, and instead of Akron, Ohio. And those were all sent back to, and when they were putting the King collection together, and I call it the King collection, King's the one that did it, but it was based on Hanauer's collection of Masonic pennies, and it was probably the largest for that time period. Hanauer didn't start till about 1899, and there's about 10 years which the pennies were being issued before that. But I'm from Tennessee, and this is my favorite penny, Pythagoras Chapter number 23 from Murfreesboro. They went extinct in 1897. And this is listed as one of the rarer Lovett dies. And I was real lucky to get a copy of it. Lovett also did one for the McAllister the Indian chapter out of McAllister, Oklahoma. And it's another extremely rare penny. He misspelled McAllister. He sort of bad. He had about 10, and both of them had two of them had errors on them. Greeley chapter number 13 from Colorado. I have not been able to get an image of the front of it. I know that it had the Kalamazoo reverse, but no image of the front until I can go to the house of the temple and get a copy then. We really want to be able to scan the collection at the house of the temple and put it out for people to see, but with COVID right now, it's a problem. George Hampton Lovett died in 1894. And this particular die, Washington, and it has his GHL on it, was not made until 1899. It was made by the Mount Vernon chapter for the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth. So his dies were still being used 5 years after he died. But the Lovetts are some of the really super rare Masonic pennies that most people have never seen. Friend of mine talked to a gentleman in his 80s, been collecting Colorado for years, and Masonic pennies from Colorado, and he didn't even know the Greeley existed. Okay. In the early days, some of the pennies, like the Lovett, people weren't collecting. Hanauer didn't start until 1899. That time, Wright and several others started collecting, but it was hard to do because most Masons, once they earned their penny, a whole lot of them were buried with them. They had an apron on as part of the Masonic funeral, and their penny was in their apron. Now, this particular one, Lone Royal Arch Chapter, Lone was annexed into Chicago in 1889, and the chapter was started in 1893. The one that says Chicago, Illinois, is listed in Wright, is listed in King, but there's never been anywhere where one saying Chicago Lone existed. This was part of the Virgil Brand collection. I got it off of eBay. The dealer that's selling it didn't recognize the Chicago Lone, and I really didn't recognize it until I got it, looked at one I had and saw the difference. So the Masons, the wrinkled hat was sort of a symbol of humility. And that was the part of the Lone chapters. Now there's these other three are some of the three rounding out. These are what I've shown so far are the rarest of the Masonic pennies. The Franklin chapter from Upper Alton, Illinois, I think was probably a love it, but I could be wrong. It has a love it look. When Dr. Wright, who was president of ANA and wrote the 3 little booklets on Masonic pennies in 1901 to 1904, in his estate, they only described about a dozen different Masonic pennies, and the Franklin chapter was one of them. The Houston chapter was another. The Greeley, Colorado chapter was another. So it's a real rare penny. Lafayette chapter number 2 out of Fort Gaines, Georgia. Don't know who made it. I've only ever heard of 2 of them. Then Washington facing left. This was probably done in the early 1890s, but Wright didn't mention it. It wasn't in any of his booklets. So I'm guessing it was made before Wright's was done. And since some Masonic chapters would not let a non-member have one of their pennies, one of the things that Dr. Wright wrote about in one of his booklets was that Masons should share with fellow Masons. They don't need to share with non-Masons, but they should share with fellow Masons on their pennies. But they also, Benny Loy, in his writing on it, said that it was un-Masonic to give away your penny if you had a mark on it. So under dispensation, when a chapter first started, they wanted to have a penny. It might take a year or 2 to get a charter. So they would start out, and instead of a chapter number, they would have UD. That means that they were working with the grand chapter of their state to get a charter. So here's a fellowship chapter out of Chicago with the UD, integrity chapter with the UD. And here's an interesting one, Niagara chapter with a UD out of Chicago. Now, the interesting thing about it, when it chartered, it wasn't Niagara chart. Evidently, the state didn't like the name, so it was chartered Liberty chapter number 251 when it finally got a charter number. In the early days, they were, a keystone is very important to a Mason. In an arch, the stone at the top, the stone that brings the 2 sections together, is the keystone. So early on, some chapters used keystones instead of pennies. And in the long run, the pennies wore out. But here's some interesting keystones. Enameled 1907, and this belonged to Elmer Kidder of Worcester, Mass. This over here, again, had a lot of enamel work on it and has the mark of the Mason. This is from Eastland, Texas, and it was W.W. Anderson. That one's 10 karat gold. Then a lot of the keystones were just stamped. And keystones didn't survive as long as the pennies. The pennies took over. Encused wax-filled pennies. Now, Dr. Wright, who was president of ANA, really hated these. I mean, he ranted and raved about how ugly they were in his booklets. Well, this one has a little thing that makes it not so bad. William McKinley, that's President William McKinley, this was his penny. A lot of the incuse ones, the die, they had a die for the front, and then on the back, they had a stamp with Canton, Ohio, and the Keystone. And in this case, his name was put in it as it was made. Now, it was unmasonic to make, multiple ones of these, because that was President McKinley's, and you just couldn't make them and give them away, because a marked penny that way, and his name was his mark, you just didn't give away. Now, the first shekel was made by the King Cyrus chapter in Detroit in 1895. We found a writing that explained the history of that one in one of King's work. Well, this is what it looked like a little later. I have somewhere a piece just like this, but the keystone is missing, and it was stamped on a white piece of silver. Keystone's missing, and there's solder places where it was soldered. So that was probably one of the original, what's left of the original. I don't know if any, the actual original keystones are still in place. Now, here's a major goof. Mason, to be a Mason, you have to believe in God. Well, the web check, and they were, messing around with money. They had, there was some chapters that came up with denarius. You had the shekels, you had the pennies. Well, the web chapter got a mark off of a Persian penny and put it on theirs. And the mark had information on a lesser god that wasn't, the one that the Masons believed in. And Dr. Wright had a fit about it, and it was quickly no longer used. And this is a penny with just a super interesting story on it. Now, progression. We talked about these being made over 130 years. Some of them I've seen where the actual dies were probably used close to 60 to 70 years. This particular penny is the Monroe chapter out of Detroit. And you'll notice there's a period after 1918. But if you look at the keystone, the corners are indented. It looks more like a coffin than a keystone. That was the first type 1 of that particular penny. There was some complaints about the keystone looking like a coffin, so they redid it and came out with type 2, and it had the regular keystone quarters on it. Wright listed the type 1, King listed the type 2, and then type 3, it's got a smaller date on it, and they were having some problems around here, the shovel wearing in, and they went ahead and redesigned so the circle and the letters are smaller. The crow goes straight up instead of being at an angle, and it so most people that collect Masonic pennies really don't realize that there's 3 different varieties. The first one's probably used 1890 to maybe 1910. Second one used 1910 to somewhere in the late 20s, and the third one was after the 20s. You know, with 130 years of pennies, you're bound to have some errors. This one, the Newark chapter number 117, they have it as Newark, New Jersey, but chapter 117 was Newark, New York. New Jersey didn't have 117 chapters. Then you've got Enderlin, South Dakota. Well, Enderlin was actually in North Dakota. When they made the die on it, they goofed and put another one with the wrong state on it. Poplar Bluff, Missouri is spelled Poplar, like the tree. This is popular. Another interesting error. And one from here close to where I live, and let's see how, if you notice the AH is missing. This is Mount Pisgah. The AH is missing, and we went back and looked, Heath White went back and looked at the die, and the die, when they made a mistake, they threw the die away and made another one, and so the die with the AH missing is not there. It wasn't in the inventory. There are 3,300 dies still in existence from making Masonic pennies. And there's going to be a major effort underway to add those to token catalog. We've already added over 17,000 Masonic pennies to token catalog, and soon we'll have the dies. Okay, Prince Hall or Clandestine. Prince Hall was a well-educated preacher in Massachusetts. He was African American or Jamaican American. While British were there, he was a member, him and several other Black Masons were members of the British chapter that were there. When it became another country, they tried to, came United States, they tried to join the Massachusetts chapter. Well, Massachusetts would not let them. So they went to Britain and got a British charter. So Prince Hall chapters are African American chapters. And this one, it says Prince Hall chapter number 7, Clio, Alabama. The early Masons did not recognize these. There has never been, King in the book on Masonic chapter pennies probably listed 24 and called them clandestine. So we're working on trying to identify them, and about the only way we can identify a lot of them is they say Prince Hall, or like this Alpha chapter number 1 from Chattanooga, and it's chartered 1971. Well, the number 1 from Tennessee was chartered in the early 1800s. So we know it wasn't from the state grand chapter. It was likely a Prince Hall. But we also run into the period problem where there were some people that wanted to be Masons and couldn't be Mason. If you weren't an upstanding person, they wouldn't let you do it. So they made their own pennies and started clandestine chapters. There were a few examples of Masonic pennies made on bimetal, and the St. Louis and the Stockton, there's examples at the House of the Temple. This other one, the Lincoln Park chapter, this one was Virgil Brand's. And if y'all don't know, Virgil Brand had one of the early magnificent coin collections. He owned a brewery in Chicago and lived upstairs. And he had people go all over the country looking for coins for him. He had a couple of people on the payroll, and that was their jobs. And sometimes some of them may have gotten made just for Virgil. I'm not so sure about this Lincoln one, but it could have been made for him. But Virgil Brand's coin collection was sold in the 20s, all except his Masonic pennies. And they weren't sold until the 1980s. And if it hadn't been for Brand, a lot of Masonic pennies would be unknown now. I've mentioned the marks. When a Mason was raised or exalted to a Royal Archmason, they went to their chapter book and put their mark in it. This is from the Pentucket Chapter of Boothbay Harbor, Maine, and it's got the mark of Sea Dog. The Masons were very proud of their marks. Sometimes if they couldn't do it, they would hire an artist to draw their mark in the book and then put the mark on their penny. Some of the marks are spectacular. But marks were extremely important. In the Royal Arch Masons that made the arches, often, well, there was a 64-page booklet on use of marks and what to do about marks and what was accepted and what wasn't. It was that important. I look at some fancy marks. This one is B. Albert Cook's mark. He was a famous early projectionist. He was the first to do projections at outdoor facilities. He had a big projector and he had projected on the side of a building. So his mark, and I'll zoom it up, was a projector on his mark, on his Keystone, and he became a Mason January 6, 1914, a Royal Arch Mason. And there's a poster from one of his high-class motion picture productions. This mark is from West Haven, Connecticut, and I've zoomed it up. This is a streetcar, and some of the transportation historic people could figure out who this was. It looks like the streetcar ran from maybe the City Hall, and it was EE and a Y. A Y is where they would, anyway, it's a very interesting mark. That mark is only about a ½ inch across, and they engraved that into that ½ inch. This particular one, the Doric chapter was in Oneida, New York, and Oneida was famous for silverware and pottery. And the mark on this particular gentleman is a teapot. And on the back of his penny, he put his name and the date he became a Mason, Royal Arch Mason, 1906. This Doric column is on the penny. He just shaved off the rest of it. Then these, we believe, are works of the Illinois Watch Case Company. Seen about a dozen of them now. There's from 5 or 6 different chapters in the Chicago area. And I was able to run the name down on one of them. He was the secretary treasurer of the Illinois Watch Case Company. And we believe they did these. They had these 2 on the left are glass encased. Then there were some of them that they just, enameled the penny and put the name and the mark on it. But these were some really nice pieces. I've got maybe 7 or 8 of them. Now here's the Masonic penny most of you know, and it's sort of an ugly finale. They invented a thing called a pantograph where they could make a die very, very fast and inexpensively. And then that die, every time it came, the chapter needed more, they either kept their die or the company that made them kept the die. So when they went back in, they would use whatever reverse was being used at that time. And this one had a chisel without a head. This one a chisel with a head. This one a chisel without a head. They probably had to go in and re-enter that die. So these no longer had the real super artwork of a lot of the early dies. Here's some examples of dies. Several of the companies that made Masonic pennies kept merging, and they finally ended up as a company called Fraternal Supply in New London, Ohio. And these are the dies from there. And I was telling you, there's about 3,300 that we're working to get on token catalog. By the die numbers, the style, like the H2 or Henderson Ames, that was Kalamazoo, Michigan that I mentioned earlier. Henderson Ames early on used dies that somebody else made, engraved, and they had the equipment to stamp, but they didn't have engravers. So this is a project that's coming down, and we'll be able to tell now when some of the Masonic pennies were actually made. There's pennies with charter dates of 1800, but that has nothing to do when the penny was made. Now there's several references on Masonic pennies. Some of these I have electronic, searchable, and you'll send me an email. I'll send you a link and you can download them. I've got the King book. Its copyright has expired, and the Wright 3 books, theirs have expired. The latest book was done in 2015 by Waken and Watley, and I think Richard Watley may be on the presentation. There are a few of those left from Bill Waken. It's almost out of print, but they did it as a labor of love. It's got 2,700 photos in it, 10,000 listings. Token Catalog now has 17,000 listings on it. Conclusions. Masonic pennies were wide-ranging. A lot of them were very beautiful. There still needs to be a lot of research and information sharing with the hobby on them. And we're gathering a lot of this together on tokencatalog.com. If you go to tokencatalog.com, up the top left, there's a thing that says all listings. You can click on it and choose Masonic pennies, and you've got a catalog that's got all the Masonic pennies. So with that, I think I stop sharing and we'll go to questions.
All right, so we have 3 questions so far, but if any of you are watching have any other questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. First question, what is general price of common pennies? What is the most you have heard of for a rare penny?
Okay. Most of the pennies go for around $10. The most I've ever given is 300 and something. There are some that I would give more for if I could ever find one.
Yeah.
Not sure I'll ever find one.
Okay, next question. Are Masonic pennies only in the United States?
No. The U.S. chapters and the British chartered, the U.S. chartered chapters and along the Panama Canal, they had chartered 2 chapters, the Ancon and Las Cascadas. There was 2 or 3 chapters in Cuba, chapter in Peru, chapter in Shanghai. Canada has beautiful Masonic pennies. Dr. Wright was really interested in beauty of the pennies, and he got with Canadians as they were starting, and they did really nice ones. I wish the U.S. had continued like some of the early ones, but it was just too expensive. It'd take, a good engraver a week to make the die for one of those pennies.
And the next one, do they still issue pennies to new Masons today?
Yes. In fact, some of the newer ones are harder to find. You've got to, a lot of these, wait till the Mason dies and their family puts it on eBay. I've had a couple chapters that found out that I was collecting pennies, and they were nice enough to give me one, even though I'm not a Mason. But yeah, there's still doing it. And again, most of the pennies, somebody had to die for you to get it, die and not be buried with it.
Yeah. All right, I think that's all of the questions. So thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well. Oh, looks like one more one. What was the purpose or significance of the shekel design, S-H-E-K-E-L?
The shekel design had they were money. The whole idea evolved around work and wages. Some of the Canadian had like a day's pay for a day's work, something I didn't say it exactly right, but in the Bible, the people working in the vineyards were paid with shekels. So they used Hebrew shekels of biblical times on the back of those. They also used denarius, which is mentioned in the Bible. But I think some of it, there was the old nursery rhyme, seesaw, Mercury dog, Jack shall have new master, he shall have but a penny a day because he can't work any faster. And there was, in some of the early days, the Masonic was on sort of a union type thing and paying a skilled craftsman for a day's wages. By the way, there were 17 presidents that were Masons. And I think the McKinley one is the only presidential penny that's surviving.
Oh, wow. All right, I think that's it.
If somebody wants to get electronic copies of some of the books,
okay,
they can send me an email at tcarson@ewkm.net. And I'll send them a link where they can download the King chapter book is totally searchable. If you want to find something in it, there's a search button, you hit it, type what you want. You're to 10 times faster and uses a book, and the writes are the same way.
It was at EWKM, correct?
Yes.
I'm going to put it in the chat. So if
.net.
you need to reach him, it's there. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again for a wonderful presentation. If you all are wanting to see some more webinars, we have plenty coming up. You can register for them on our website. I hope you all have a great night, and we'll see you again sometime, I'm sure, Tom.
All righty. Thank you.